The sign above her head said one word: thief. But Iris Calloway had never stolen a thing in her life. She had been a seamstress at the Harland estate outside the town of Coldwater Creek, a woman of quiet hands and quieter voice, the kind of woman powerful men overlooked until they needed someone to blame. And now she sat crouched inside a wooden stockade cage, bolted to a post at the edge of the main road, her wrists raw from the rough wood, her dress damp from last night's rain, while the morning traffic of Coldwater Creek rolled past her and did not stop. It was the summer of 1891. The town sat in a shallow valley in the foothills of northern Ontario, the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, and most people owed the bank something. The bank was the Harland Trust. The Harland Trust was Gerald Harland, and Gerald Harland had decided that Iris Calloway had stolen from him. 3 nights earlier, $200 had vanished from the locked study on the second floor of Harland Hall. By the following morning, Gerald's nephew, Preston Harland, had arranged for the money to be found in the lining of Iris's sewing basket in the servant quarters. The constable on duty, a slope-shouldered man named Fitch, who had owed Gerald Harland 4 years of back rent, had conducted what passed for a search and what passed for justice in Coldwater Creek. No trial, no questions asked of any witness who might have given an inconvenient answer. Just Iris, dragged across the yard in front of the other servants and a cage at the edge of the road, and a painted sign nailed above her head. Now it was late morning, and she had been there since dawn. Wagons slowed as they passed. She could see the faces of the drivers, the way their eyes found her, and then found something else immediately: the horizon, the horses' ears, a spot on their own boots. A woman in a green shawl actually looked right at her and pressed her lips together in what might have been sorrow. Then her husband reached over and touched her arm, and they moved on. Iris did not weep. She was past the easy relief of weeping. She gripped the wooden slat in front of her and breathed through the shame, because shame was what Harland had intended, shame that would outlast the cage, shame that would follow her out of Coldwater Creek, no matter which road she took when they finally let her go. If they let her go. She had not eaten since the morning before her arrest. The summer heat pressed against the cage like a hand over her mouth. She thought about what she had heard. 3 nights ago, she had been in the upstairs hall carrying a basket of mended cuffs back to the dressing room, when she had passed the study door and heard 2 men arguing inside. She had not meant to stop. She stopped anyway because one of them was crying, and she had recognized the voice. It belonged to young Daniel Marsh, the estate's bookkeeper, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers and a mother in Barrie who wrote him long letters he kept folded in his breast pocket. The other voice was Preston Harland's, smooth and cold and utterly certain of itself. "You keep your mouth shut," Preston had said, "or I will see to it that your mother's letters stop coming because she won't have an address to send them to." Then the study door had swung open, and Preston had found Iris standing in the hall, with her basket, and her wide eyes, and her terrible timing. He had smiled at her with every tooth in his head. By the next evening, the money was found in her sewing basket, and she was in a cage. She thought about Daniel Marsh. She thought about whether he was frightened enough to stay quiet. She decided he probably was. Iris leaned her head against the wooden slat and closed her eyes and tried to remember what her mother had told her about endurance. Her mother had grown up in a sod house in Saskatchewan and had raised 4 children in a 2-room cabin outside of Sudbury, and had never, in all of Iris's recollection, once asked anyone to feel sorry for her. "Dignity isn't what other people give you," she used to say. "It's what you hold on to when they try to take it." Iris held on. The man who saw her first came into Coldwater Creek from the northwest road at noon, riding a gray horse that moved at the patient, unhurried pace of a horse that had been ridden a long distance many times before. His name was Owen Delaney. He owned Larch Hill Farm 5 miles outside of town, 160 acres of mixed bush and cleared pasture that he had spent 11 years turning from rocky wilderness into something livable. something his late wife Maren had believed in before she died. He was 43 years old. He had a weathered face and a permanent crease between his eyes from squinting into too many cold mornings. And he had not been to Coldwater Creek in 6 weeks, which was longer than usual because he had not felt much like being around people since Maren's funeral in April. He was coming in for fence wire and salt blocks and nothing else. He saw the cage before he saw the woman inside it. He saw the sign second. He reined the gray horse to a stop at the side of the road and looked at the cage properly. Then he looked at the woman inside it. She was perhaps 30 years old. Dark hair pinned back, though several strands had come loose. A mended gray dress, now dusty and creased. Her hands gripped the wooden slat in front of her with a steadiness that did not match the condition of the rest of her. And when she felt his eyes on her, she looked back at him without flinching. She did not beg him. She did not look away. He did not know why that was the thing that held him, but it did. "How long have you been in there?" he asked. Her voice was dry and careful. "Since yesterday at dawn." Owen looked toward the town. The main street was visible from here, and 2 men stood near the general store watching him. He recognized one of them as a deputy who worked for the local constable. The other he didn't know. He looked back at the woman. "What's your name?" "Iris Calloway." "What did they say you did?" She met his gaze. "They said I stole $200 from Gerald Harland's estate." "Did you?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise her. She looked at him for a moment. "No." Owen sat on the horse for another 3 seconds. He thought about his fence wire. He thought about Maren, who had died in April and was buried under the birch trees at the top of the east pasture, and who had once, when he tried to justify not helping a stranded family on the road because it would add 2 hours to a trip he was already late for, said to him without raising her voice, "Owen, a good reason is not the same thing as the right reason." He swung down from the horse. There was a padlock on the cage door, a heavy one, but the hinge plate on the post side was held by 3 nails that had begun to rust. Owen took the fencing pliers from his saddlebag, and then thought better of it, and took out the short pry bar instead. "Hey!" The deputy was crossing the road now, moving fast. "Hey, Delaney, you leave that alone." Owen placed the flat end of the pry bar behind the hinge plate and leaned on it. The wood cracked. The hinge plate gave. The cage door sagged open. "Harland will have your farm," the deputy said, "right behind him now. He'll call your note and take every last board off your fences, do you hear me?" Owen pulled the cage door back and crouched down to look at Iris Calloway. Her eyes were dry. She was shaking. "Can you walk?" he asked. She straightened. "Yes." She came out of the cage on her own, and Owen steadied her once when her knees buckled, one hand briefly at her elbow, and then she stood. She was taller than he expected. She looked at the deputy, who had gone quiet in a way that suggested he was uncertain of what to do next. "Your name is Miss Calloway," Owen said, looking at the sign above the cage. Not at her, at the sign. He reached up and knocked it down with the flat of his palm. It landed in the ditch. Then he turned to her. "I'm Owen Delaney. My farm is 5 miles northwest. You can ride my horse as far as you need to go." Iris looked at him. Something moved across her face that she quickly steadied. "Why?" she asked. It was a fair question. He considered it honestly. "Because you didn't beg," he said. "And because my wife would have done the same." Iris looked at the empty cage, the broken hinge, the deputy standing in the road. Then she looked at Owen. "All right," she said. As he helped her onto the gray horse and led it away from the cage, Owen did not look back at the deputy. He did not need to. He had said what he had come to say. He had done what he had come to do. He had not planned either of those things when he left for Coldwater Creek this morning. But Maren would have said that was exactly the point. Larch Hill Farm sat at the end of a long lane lined with spruce trees, a 2-story house of gray clapboard, and a barn painted the deep red of old blood. The house was clean but spare, the kind of clean that came from a single person maintaining a space he no longer truly inhabited. The curtains were drawn on the south-facing windows. There was a rocker on the porch that had not been sat in for months. Owen brought water first. He set a tin cup on the kitchen table beside Iris, and did not hover over her while she drank it, because she seemed like a woman who did not want to be watched in her relief. He warmed broth on the stove. He found a bar of good soap and a clean cloth and left them near the basin in the back room, along with one of Marin's blouses, which was perhaps strange, but it was all he had. He knocked on the door before he left it. "There's a blouse on the chair," he said through the wood. "It was my wife's. You're welcome to it." A pause. Then, "Thank you." He went back to the kitchen and sat down and stared at the table and tried to decide what he had just committed himself to. The answer arrived in the form of Deputy Fitch's horse coming up the lane at 3 in the afternoon, and behind him, 2 men Owen didn't recognize but whose horses had the look of hired animals. Owen went to the porch. "She stole from Gerald Harland," Fitch called, staying on horseback, because the look on Owen's face discouraged dismounting. "You're harboring a thief. That's a criminal matter, Delaney." "She told me she didn't steal anything." Her word against Harland's. "There are only 2 kinds of men in this county," Owen said. "Ones who ask whose word it is, and ones who ask what the evidence shows. Which are you, Fitch?" Fitch's jaw worked. "Harland will call your note. He's welcome to try. He'll have you ruined." "Maybe." Owen looked at the 2 hired men. They had the tired, uninvested expressions of men who were being paid by the day and didn't much care how the day ended. "But not today. And not from my porch." Fitch pointed a finger at him. "This isn't over." "No," Owen agreed. "It isn't." He waited until the horses had gone down the lane and around the spruce trees before he went back inside. Iris was standing at the kitchen door. She had changed into Marin's blouse. It was a little short in the sleeve, but she had rolled the cuffs back and stood very straight, and the shaking was gone from her hands now. "You should know what you're involved in," she said. Owen pulled out the chair across from her. "Sit down and tell me." She sat. He sat, and she told him everything. The hall, the raised voices, Preston's threat to Daniel Marsh, the way the study door had opened, and Preston had found her standing there with her basket, the smile that had told her exactly what came next. Owen listened without looking away. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "This Daniel Marsh," he said, "is he still at the estate?" "As far as I know." "Would he tell the truth if someone gave him a reason to believe it was safe?" Iris folded her hands on the table. She thought about the ink-stained fingers and the letters from Barry in his breast pocket. "He'd want to," she said. "That's not the same as would." "No," Owen said, "but it's the beginning of it." He looked out the kitchen window at the lane. The afternoon light was coming long and level across the hayfield, the way it did in summer, when the days stretched themselves thin. He thought about his note at the Harland Trust. He thought about the east pasture and the birch trees and Marin under the grass at the top of the hill. Then he thought about what it would mean to go back to walking those fields alone, because he'd been too careful to matter. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want an honest answer." Iris looked at him. "Are you willing to go back to Coldwater Creek and face this publicly?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he knew she was giving it real consideration rather than the fast, brave answer that pride often produces and fear often walks back later. "Yes," she said, "but I don't want you to carry it for me." "I wasn't planning to," he said. "I thought we'd carry it together." Something shifted in her face. Not relief, not quite. Something older than relief. The expression of a person who has been braced against a weight so long they have forgotten what it's like to share the load. "All right," she said. Owen reached across the table and tapped the surface once, lightly, the way a man makes a decision by placing his hand somewhere solid. "Then we'll need to find the people who saw the truth and were too frightened to say it." Iris nodded slowly. "I know who they are." "Good." He pushed back from the table. "We leave in the morning." They went to Daniel Marsh first. He lived in a boarding house on the east side of town, a narrow building on a street that smelled of coal smoke and river mud. Owen knocked. Daniel answered in his shirt sleeves and went pale when he saw Iris standing beside a man he didn't know. "I'm not here to cause you trouble," Iris said. "You already are," Daniel said, though he didn't close the door. "I heard what Preston threatened," she said, "and I know you've been holding that alone for 3 days." Daniel's eyes moved to Owen. "Who are you?" "Owen Delaney, Larch Hill, northwest of town." Daniel looked at Iris again. "Fitch is telling everyone Delaney took a criminal from lawful custody." "Fitch is protecting the man who paid him to protect him," Owen said. "That's different from law." Daniel was quiet. He had the pressed-in look of a person who has spent too long inside a decision that he knows is wrong. "What do you want from me?" "The truth," Iris said. "Spoken somewhere people can hear it. If I do that, Preston will." "I know what Preston will do," Iris said. "I've been in a cage because of it." Silence. Daniel's hand on the doorframe was white at the knuckles. "No one should have asked you to carry this alone," Owen said. "We're not asking that either. We're asking you to stand with her, not instead of her." Daniel looked at the floor. He reached into his breast pocket, almost automatically, and touched the edge of a letter. His mother's, presumably. He stood there with his fingers on that folded paper for a long moment. "Preston took the money," he said quietly, not looking up. "I saw him at the strongbox. He saw me see him, and then he told me what would happen to my mother's address if I said a word to anyone." He looked up. His face was miserable and resolved at once. "I'll speak," he said. They found the housekeeper, Agnes Pruitt, at the Harland Estates kitchen gate, scrubbing a pot in a bucket of gray water. She looked at Iris for a long moment and then set the pot down. "I heard the argument in the hall that night," she said, before Iris had said a thing about it. "I was at the top of the servants' stairs. I heard Preston and that young bookkeeper." She looked at Owen. "And I heard Preston come down to my kitchen at midnight to get a lamp. Would you say that publicly?" Owen asked. Agnes looked at the estate house behind her, a large house. Her cottage was on the grounds. She had worked there for 17 years. "If I speak against a Harland," she said, "I lose everything I've built in this town." "If you don't," Iris said gently, "someone else will sit in that cage for the next lie he needs to tell." Agnes Pruitt dried her hands on her apron. Her face had gone through something while Iris was talking. A reckoning, perhaps, a private accounting of years, and what she had let pass in them. "All right," she said. "I'll come." The last person was Nathaniel Voss, who ran the livery stable where Preston Harland had returned his horse on the night in question. Nathaniel was 62 years old and had been shoeing horses in Coldwater Creek since before Owen was born, and when Owen explained what they needed, he did something neither of them expected. He laughed. "I've been waiting 3 days for someone to ask me," he said. "Preston came in at midnight with mud on his boots and his coat torn at the breast pocket. Paid me in gold pieces, new ones." He squinted at Iris. "I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner. I didn't know where you'd gone." "Will you say it at the meeting hall?" Iris asked. "Been saying it to my horses all week," Nathaniel said. "Time I set it to a room." The weekly gathering at Coldwater Creek's meeting hall was on Thursday evening. By the time Owen and Iris walked in together, the room held perhaps 60 people, half sitting and half standing along the walls, and Gerald Harland was already at the front with Preston beside him and Constable Fitch 2 steps behind. The room went quiet when Iris walked in. Not the frightened quiet of people pretending not to see something. The held breath quiet of people who had been wondering what would happen next. Gerald Harland was 60 years old and had the look of a man accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. He watched Iris cross the floor without apparent concern. "You have some nerve," he said, "returning here after everything." "I never left of my own choosing," Iris said. She turned to face the room. There was no podium, no ceremony, just her, standing in the center of the hall where she had once attended town socials and Christmas services and never thought she would be standing like this. "My name is Iris Calloway," she said. "I worked at Harland Hall for 4 years. 3 days ago, I was locked in a cage at the edge of your road and labeled a thief. I want to tell you what I saw and what I heard, and then I want to stand beside the people who saw and heard the same." Gerald raised his hand. "This is—" "Let her speak." The voice came from the back wall. It was Nathaniel Voss, arms folded, looking like a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. Around him, a few others murmured agreement. Iris spoke. She kept her voice level, and her eyes on the room rather than on Harland. She told it the way it had happened. The hall outside the study. The argument. Preston's face in the lamplight, the smile. She told them about her sewing basket, and the coins placed there by hands that were not hers. She told them about the cage and the sign, and the wagons that had passed without stopping, and she said it without accusation, because she understood by now that fear was its own kind of cage, and most of those wagons had a Harland mortgage note folded somewhere inside them. When she finished, Daniel Marsh stepped forward. He stood beside her and told the room what he had seen at the strongbox and what Preston had threatened, and the 3 days he had spent carrying the weight of his own silence. His voice shook. He kept going. Agnes Pruitt came next, small and upright, and told the room about the midnight lamp and the servant stairs and 17 years she had spent keeping her head down, and how she was done with that now. And then Nathaniel Voss pushed away from the wall and described midnight and mud-caked boots and new gold pieces and the torn breast pocket on Preston Harland's coat. The room had gone very still. Preston's face had moved through several expressions during this accounting, and none of them were steady. He was a young man whose confidence was borrowed from his uncle's name, his uncle's accounts, his uncle's willingness to protect him, and standing in a room where that protection was visibly fraying, he did not know what to do with his hands. Gerald Harland turned to Fitch. "Remove these people." Fitch didn't move. "Caleb." Harland's voice was harder now. Fitch looked at the room. He looked at the 4 people standing beside Iris Calloway. Owen quiet on her left. Daniel and Agnes and Nathaniel ranged behind her. And then he looked at Gerald Harland, and something in his chest seemed to make a decision independently of the rest of him. "I'm not removing anyone," he said. The room seemed to exhale. "Uncle," Preston said. His voice had gone small. "I only meant to borrow it. I had debts. You wouldn't have given me the money, and I thought if it was her, if it was just the seamstress." "Preston." Harland's voice was a warning and a wall and a plea all at once. Nobody would question it. She had no one. She had no one to go to. The silence after that was the loudest thing in the room. Iris looked at Preston Harland for a long moment. She did not yell. She did not weep. She had held her dignity in a cage in the summer heat for 2 days, and she was not going to surrender it now. "I had no one," she agreed. "And you were right that the town would look away. But you were wrong that it would keep looking away." She turned to the room. There were tears on some faces. There was anger on others. There was the particular expression of people who have been complicit in something and are now deciding, in real time, who they intend to be next. "This town isn't cruel," she said. "It's been frightened. Those are not the same thing, and I think most of you already know that." Gerald Harland left the meeting hall without another word, walking through a crowd that moved aside for him, not out of deference, but out of the ordinary human instinct to step back from something falling. Fitch arrested Preston Harland on the front steps. 3 weeks later, Coldwater Creek held a public accounting. Otis Bremner, at the general store, opened his ledger on the front counter and spent 2 days going through accounts that Gerald Harland had manipulated over 14 years, inflated interest, altered totals, debts that had grown in ways their holders had never agreed to. A lawyer from Sudbury arrived on the Thursday train. It was a slow, unglamorous, necessary kind of justice, the kind that happens in columns of numbers rather than dramatic confrontations, and it mattered more than any dramatic confrontation could have. The cage was taken down by 3 men from the hardware shop who seemed embarrassed it had stood as long as it had. The post it was bolted to was pulled from the ground and the hole was filled in, and someone, nobody ever admitted who, planted a wild rose bush where it had been. Iris Calloway stayed in the spare room at Larch Hill Farm through August while the matter of her reputation was formally resolved. She mended things while she was there, because her hands needed occupation and the farm had a great deal that wanted mending. She fixed the broken step on the porch. She repaired the south curtains that had been drawn for months. She opened the windows in the mornings, and the house began to smell like grass and wind instead of grief held in suspension. Owen watched this happen with the cautious attention of a man who has been alone long enough that the presence of another person in his house feels like learning a new language. One evening he came in from the barn to find her on the porch with a cup of tea, looking out over the hayfield in the late light, and she turned when she heard his boots and said, "This is a good farm." "It is," he said. Marin was right to believe in it. He sat down in the rocker and was quiet for a moment. Marin's name had been unsayable for months, stuck somewhere in his throat like a word in a language he could no longer speak without pain. But Iris said it simply, without ceremony, the way you say the name of someone who mattered and still does, and somehow that made it bearable. "She'd have liked you," he said. Iris smiled a small, tired smile. "I'd have liked her." They sat on the porch as the light faded, not saying much, comfortable with the silence in a way that takes time to build between people. In September, when the first cold mornings came down from the north, Iris made preparations to leave for Sudbury, where she had a cousin and a prospect of work as a seamstress. Owen drove her to the train station in the wagon. He held her hand at the platform. "You should know," she said, "that I understand what you risked." "It wasn't risk," he said. "It was what needed doing. Those aren't always the same thing for people." "No," he said, "but they were for me." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something he had not expected. She placed her other hand over his, so that his hand was held between both of hers, and she held it that way for a long moment without saying anything. "Write to me," he said. "I will," she said. She did write, the first letter arriving 3 weeks later, written in a careful even hand on paper that smelled faintly of cedar. He wrote back the same night he received it. By February, the letters were arriving every 10 days. By spring they had covered, between them, the subjects of farming and grief and justice, and what it means to begin again. And one letter in March, written near midnight by lamplight in a farmhouse where a man had been learning to live again, said, "I think you already know that Larch Hill has not felt empty since August. I think you already know why." Her letter in return took 2 weeks to arrive, long enough that he had concluded he'd miscalculated, and then it came. "I know. I've known since the porch in September. I was waiting for you to say it first because the last person to stand up in a public room shouldn't also have to be the first one to say the quiet thing. Come in April. The roses I planted in Coldwater Creek will be up by then, and I want you to see them." He came in April. The rosebush was blooming at the edge of the road where the cage had stood. 3 years of growth now, wild and thorny and very much alive. Iris stood beside it, with her arms folded across her chest in the way of a person who has weathered something and knows it, and when Owen walked toward her across the road, she unfolded her arms. He did not promise her a life without difficulty. He was too honest a man for that, and she was too clear-eyed a woman to want it. He promised her the same farm he'd kept through grief and fear and a winter of letters, the red barn and the spruce-lined lane, and the east pasture where Marin slept under the birch trees, where there was room for more than one kind of love and more than one kind of beginning. She said yes. They were married in June, in the yard at Larch Hill Farm, under a sky that Ontario does in early summer, wide and clear and impossibly blue. The people of Coldwater Creek came, many of them. Daniel Marsh brought a gift and a letter of apology that he had rewritten 6 times and still didn't think was sufficient. Agnes Pruitt brought a jar of blackberry preserves. Nathaniel Voss brought his fiddle and played until the fireflies came out. Iris wore a dress the color of the summer sky and held Owen's hand in front of all of them. And when the words were said and the thing was done, she looked at the people gathered in that yard. Frightened people who had found their way back to themselves and thought about cages. A cage is just iron until you give it power, she thought. Power to name you, to shame you, to tell you who you are. Take that power back, and the iron is just iron. And iron can become anything. In Coldwater Creek, the wild rose bloomed each summer at the edge of the road, and people who passed it began to leave things there. A ribbon, a stone, a note folded small. Nobody organized this. It simply happened, the way small dignities do, quietly and without ceremony, one person at a time. And at Larch Hill Farm, the red lantern that Owen had kept burning over the barn door since Maren died and still burned each night. Not for the dead now, but for the living. For anyone on the Northwest Road who needed to know that something warm and solid waited at the end of a long lane. Some nights Owen stood in the yard and watched it, and Iris came to stand beside him, and they were quiet together, the way two people are quiet when they have stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. "Strange thing," Owen said one evening. "How it took losing everything twice to find out what I was made of." Iris looked at the lantern. "I don't think it's strange," she said. "I think that's just how it works." He looked at her. "How what works?" She took his hand in the dark. "Mercy," she said.